Chapter 6. Duke Valen's letter rode with an official courier as far as Forza. There it was transferred to a pack train carrying silver ingots and mountain goat skins, half-tanned for the luxury footwear trade, as far as Lona Zep. It waited there a day or so until a shipment of copper and tin ore came in from the Curidoce, and hitched a ride with the wagons to Mezentia. There it lay forgotten in a canvas satchel, along with reports from the Foundrymen's Guild's commercial resident in Doria Voce, and on one side of a fractious correspondence about delivery rates and penalty clauses in the wholesale rope trade, until someone woke it up and carried it to the guild hall, where it was opened in error by a clerk from the wrong department, set on a long tour of the building, and finally washed up on the desk of the proper official like a beached whale. The proper official immediately convened an emergency meeting. This should have been held in the Grand Chamber, but the Social and Benevolent Association had booked the chamber for the day, and it was too short notice to cancel, so the committee was forced to cram itself into the smaller of the two chapter houses on the 7th floor. It was a beautiful room, needless to say, perfectly circular with a vaulted roof and gilded traces supported by 12 impossibly slender gray stone columns. It was decorated with frescoes in the grand manner, briefly popular 120 years earlier, when allegory was regarded as the height of sophisticated taste. Accordingly, the committee huddled, 3 men to a 2-man bench, between the feet and in the shadows of vast, plump, nude giants and giantesses, all delicately poised in attitudes of refined emotion. Authority, in a monstrous gold helmet like a cooper's bucket, accepted the world's scepter from the hands of wisdom and obedience, while a flight of stocky angels, their heads all turned full face in accordance with the prevailing convention, floated serenely by on dumplings of white cloud. At ground level they were way past serenity. Luke Celis, chairman of the Compliance Directorate, had just read out the Vidani's letter. For once nobody appreciated the exquisite acoustics of the chapter house. The wretched words rang out clear as bells and chased each other round and round the cupped belly of the dome, when they should have been whispered and quickly hushed away. In fact, Celis concluded, it's hard to see how things could possibly be any worse. We take a man, a hard-working, loyal guild officer, who happens to have made one stupid mistake, and in trying to make an example of him, we coerce him into violence and murder and drive him into the arms of our current worst enemy, a man whose technical knowledge and practical ability gives him the capability of betraying at least 37 restricted techniques and a score of other trade secrets. Result? It's imperative that he's caught and disposed of as quickly as possible, but now he's in pretty much the hardest place in the world for us to winkle him out of. I'm not saying it can't be done. I don't see a problem, someone interrupted. We know the Aremians got him. Surely that's more than half the battle. It's what you don't have a clue where to start looking that it's difficult to process a job. Meanwhile, I'm prepared to bet, after what's just happened, I don't see this Duke Orsi giving us much trouble, provided we put the wind up him forcefully enough. He's just had a crash course in what happens to people who mess with us. And besides, what actual harm can he do? The Aremians are primitives. If Faatzes was minded to betray guild secrets, how is he going to go about it? They're in no position to exploit anything he tells them. They've got no manufacturing capacity, no infrastructure. They can barely make a horseshoe up in those mountains. Faatzes would have to teach them to start from scratch. Celis scowled in the direction of where the voice had come from. Because of the annoying echo, he couldn't quite place the voice, and the speaker's face had been lost against a background of primary colors and pale apricot. For a start, he said, that's entirely beside the point. If we don't deal with this Faatzes straight away, it sets a dangerous precedent. Troublemakers and malcontents will see that here's a man who broke the rules and got away with it. Furthermore, you know as well as I do, a trade secret is a negotiable commodity. The Aremians may not be able to use it, but there's nothing to stop them selling it to someone who can. No, we've got to face facts. This is a crisis, and we've got to take it seriously. This is exactly the sort of situation we were put here for. The question is, how do we go about it? There was a brief silence, just long enough for his words to come to rest in the vaulting, like bees settling in a tree full of blossom. Well, someone said, it's obviously not a job we can tackle ourselves, not directly. Any one of our people would stick out a mile among the tribesmen. I say we put a tender out to the traders. It wouldn't be the first time, and they'll do anything for money. That was simply stating the obvious, but at least they were getting somewhere. No small achievement in a committee of political appointees. Celis nodded. The merchant adventurers are clearly the place to start, he said. We've got a reasonable network of contacts in place now. At the very least, they can do the field work and gather the necessary intelligence. Where he is exactly, the sort of security measures we'll have to face, his daily routine, the attitude of the Duke and his people. As regards the actual capture, I'm not sure we can rely on people like that, but let's take it one step at a time. Now, who's in charge of running our contacts in the company? Manuo Christistum stood up, 6 feet of idiot, in a purple brocaded gown. Celis managed not to groan. "I have the file here," Christistum said, brandishing a parchment folder. Anticipating this discussion, I took the trouble to read it through before we convened. "There is a problem?" There was a grin behind his words. Christistum, tailors and clothiers, had only joined the committee a few months ago, replacing one of Celis' fellow foundrymen as controller of intelligence. If there was a problem, it would be the foundryman's fault, and Christistum would be only too delighted to make a full confession and abject apology on their behalf. "I regret to have to inform this committee," he said, "that our resources in Arimia Montis are unsatisfactory. We have agents in the cheese, butter, and leather trades, and among the horse breeders, but at relatively low levels. Furthermore, our resources are such that, after the recent incursion, they can no longer be relied upon. It won't take the Duke long to figure out who gave us advance warning of his adventure. Those agents will be exposed, and presumably dealt with, and it will be exceedingly difficult to recruit replacements as a result. The fact is that all our people in Arimia have been used up, in a good cause, needless to say, but now that they're gone, we have nothing worth mentioning in reserve." Muttering, slightly exaggerated, from the stonemasons and Wainwright's delegates, political committees. Celis ground on. "I take it you have something positive to propose?" "As a matter of fact, I have." Christistum smiled amiably. "It seems to me, since we cannot handle this matter delicately, we must take a more oblique approach." He opened his folder and took out a piece of paper, holding it close to his body as if it was a candle in a stiff breeze. "This came in today from one of my observers in Forza. Apparently, Duke Valens has taken a hand in the Arimian crisis. He sent significant aid to the survivors of Orsi's army, food, doctors, transport. It would appear that the alliance between Arimia and the Vidani is by no means as brittle as we had assumed." Eyebrows were raised at that, typical of the tailors to keep back genuinely important news, just to gain a brief tactical advantage. "That's an interesting development," Celis said. "Certainly. Let's confine ourselves, however, to its relevance to the matter in hand. A closer relationship between the two duchies will inevitably lead to closer commercial ties. We have excellent resources inside the Vidani mercantile. I suggest we use them. We won't be needing them for anything else. The Vidani will never be a threat to us. They have too much sense. Furthermore, we can place our own people in the Vidani court to supervise and coordinate operations. No doubt the Foreign Affairs Directorate will be sending diplomats to Duke Valens to find out what lies behind his remarkable display of neighborly feeling. The actual transaction can be managed very well from Civitas Vananis. If we manage to get Vaatzes out alive, it'll be much simpler to bring him home from there. I imagine Valens will be eager to propitiate us if he's up to something with his cousin, so we can be confident we won't be unduly hampered by interference from that quarter. It would appear to be the logical approach." Celis had, of course, hated the tailors and clothiers from birth. They were consolidationists. The foundrymen were didactics. There could be no common ground, no compromise on anything ever. Even if Manuo Christistum had been a foundryman, however, Celis would still have loathed him with every cell, hair, and drop of moisture in his body. "Agreed," he said. "Do we need to take a formal vote on this? Objections from the floor? Very well, I propose that we minute that and move on to appropriations." He gazed into Christistum's unspeakably smug face and continued. "When do you think you can let us have that draft budget for approval?" Christistum hesitated. He was apprehensive, but didn't know why. Confused presumably by his easy victory, which was understandable since the foundrymen had beaten the tailors to a pulp in every major confrontation that century. "Depends on how much detail you want me to go into at this stage," he replied. "Obviously, since we've only just agreed to this, I haven't done any proper costings, and I haven't got a plan I can cost yet, not till I sit down and work it all out." "I think we can all appreciate that," Spellis said. He knew Christistum was floundering, but it goes without saying time is of the essence. If we reconvened here, at say this time tomorrow, do you think you could have an outline plan of action with appropriation schedule for us by then? "I should think so," Christistum replied, at the very moment when both he and Celis realized what had happened. It hadn't been intentional. If it had been, Christistum told himself, I'd have seen it coming, read it in his weaselly little face. But it was a good bold counterattack, what the fencers would call a riposte in straight time. Without formal proposal or debate, Manuel Christistum had been put in charge of the whole wretched business. If he succeeded, nobody outside this room would ever know who deserved the credit. If he failed, he'd be finished in guild politics. It took a little longer, maybe the time it takes to eat an apple, for the rest of the committee to realize what had just happened. Nobody said anything, of course. It wasn't the sort of thing you discussed except in private, 2 or 3 close colleagues talking together behind locked doors. In politics, it isn't what's said it's what isn't said that matters. In politics, it's what isn't said that matters. The fencers say that you never see the move that kills you. In politics also, it appears out of nowhere, like goblins in a fairy tale, but once it's happened, you start to smell a failure. People who used to look at you and see the next director of finance or foreign affairs start turning their speculations elsewhere, and the brief hush when you enter a room has a different, rather more bitter flavor. Of course, Chrysostom might succeed. It was more likely than not that he would, but until the job was done and the file was closed, he was a man marked by the possibility of failure. Someone who might not be there anymore in 6 months' time. In a game played so many moves ahead, someone like that was at best on suspension. He might succeed, at which time he'd be eligible to start again at the foot of the ladder. Meanwhile, he had to face life as a liability in waiting. Not such a bad day after all, Celis thought. Any other business? No other business. He confirmed tomorrow's meeting. They'd be back in the great hall where they belonged, and closed. The committee stood up slowly, like the audience at the end of a particularly powerful and moving play, taking time to adjust to being back in the real world. Chrysostom indulged in the luxury of one swift, ferocious stare. Celis returned it with a gentle smile and returned to his chambers. Back in his favorite chair, facing the wall with the tarnished but glorious mosaic, Byzantine destiny, as a knight in armor riding down the twin evils of chaos and doubt, he reflected on the changed state of play. A fool would still be able to turn this fortuitous victory into a total defeat. A fool would try and take advantage by sabotaging the operation in the hopes of guaranteeing Chrysostom's downfall. It was a sore temptation. He was almost certain it could be done efficiently and discreetly, 100% success, but it was also the only way he could lose, and losing in this instance would mean disaster. The obvious alternative was to be as helpful and supportive as possible, and trust Chrysostom to destroy himself. Celis thought about that. If he had true faith in the foundryman, in the didactic movement itself, he wouldn't doubt for a moment that Chrysostom would fail, because didacticism was right, consolidation was wrong, and good always triumphs over evil. It would be easy to glide down into that belief. Chrysostom was an idiot, no question about that. But he was cunning. His clever encircling maneuver had demonstrated that, even if he had turned his victory into a desperate wire for his own feet. Celis yawned. So what if Chrysostom did succeed? He'd get no thanks for it outside the committee, because nobody would know it had been him. Inside, well, you could never tell. Celis was more inclined to believe that they'd remembered him walking blithely into the pitfall long after he'd dug his way out clutching a fistful of rubies, but you couldn't build a policy on a vague intuition. Instead, he considered the worst likely outcome. Chrysostom succeeded, thereby increasing his personal prestige inside the committee out of all recognition. So what? Just as long as Celis kept his nerve and played his moves on the merits, rather than through anger or fear, the position at the end would still be pretty much the same as it was right now. Celis would still have the actual procedural authority. He'd still see the minutes in draft before each meeting and be able to make subtle deft changes to key words under the pretext of proofreading. As for Chrysostom, the higher he rose, the further he had to come down when he finally did make a mistake. Tranquility, serenity, and patience. To take his mind off the problem, Celis reached for his copy of Va'atzi's dossier. Age 34. Guild, foundrymen and machinists. Celis sighed. One in every barrel. Physical description. He read the details, tried to compile a mental image, but failed. Nondescript then, except for his height. A tall man. 6 feet 3 inches. So among the hill tribes he'd be a giant. Family. Neither parent living. Father had been a convener at the Bloom Mills for 30 years. A wife, Ariessa, age 24, and a daughter, Maritza, age 6. So assuming she was 17 when they married, he'd have been, 10 years older? Celis frowned. Was there a story behind that? He turned back to the wife's details. Father, Todor Kanenis, a tool maker in the ordnance factory. Celis compared his works number with Va'atzi's service history. Kanenis had worked on Va'atzi's floor at the time of the marriage, therefore had been his subordinate. And Kanenis was no longer a tool maker, but a junior supervisor. Likewise, Zan Kanenis, the wife's brother, promoted at the same time as his father. Celis closed his eyes and thought about that. 150 years ago, yes, it had been quite common back then for men to marry girls much younger than themselves, particularly where the marriage was part of some greater chain of transactions. There had been trouble. He struggled to remember his ancient history. There had been trouble in the tinsmiths' guild over a marriage, and the practice had been disapproved. Not denounced, it was still perfectly legal, but you weren't supposed to do it. There had been 30 years or so of compliance, a reaction, a counter-reaction, and then it had ceased to be an issue. At best, then, it was an eccentricity. He made a note to interview the two conini, and returned to the dossier. Details of the offense, he read the technical data, straightforward enough, and the investigating officer's notes. The background was pathetic, really. A man wanted to make a nice present for his daughter, and allowed his own cleverness to tempt him into disaster. The rest of the section was unremarkable enough, except for one thing that made Celis raise his eyebrows in surprise. Next in the dossier were copies of supervisors' annual assessment reports going back 20 years. Celis sighed, poured himself a small glass of brandy, and made himself concentrate. The picture that began to emerge was of a willing, serious apprentice, a reliable and careful machinist, a good supervisor, resourceful, and look where that had got him, intelligent, a planner, content to do his work to the best visibility, a quiet man, a family man. Rarely took part in social activities, except where his status required it. A man who worked late when it was necessary, but preferred to go home on time. There had been no petty thefts of offcuts of material or discarded tools, no reports of private work done on the side, respected by his equals and his subordinates, few friends but no enemies. All those years as a supervisor, nobody hated him, and that was really rather remarkable. A mild man, but he'd married a subordinate's daughter when she was little more than a child, and promotions had followed. Query: do quiet and mild always necessarily mean the same thing? Several pages of details headed "Restricted" of his work on ordnance development projects. Celis nodded to himself. A question which had been nagging him like a mild toothache would appear to have answered himself. There were, of course, no guild specifications for military equipment. It was the only area not covered by specifications. The only area in which innovation and improvement were permitted. Va'atzis, apparently, had been responsible for no fewer than 3 amendments to improved designs, all to do with the Scorpions. An improved ratchet stop, upgrading of the thread on the sear nut axle pin from 5/8 coarse to 3/4 fine, addition of an oil nipple to the slider housing to facilitate lubrication of the slider on active service. That wasn't all. He'd proposed a further 4 amendments which had been rejected by the Standing Committee on Ordnance Design. Celis sighed. Allow a man to get the taste for innovation, and you put his very soul at risk. The Compliance Directorate had considered the issue on several occasions and had recommended a program of advanced doctrinal training to make sure that workers exposed to the danger had a proper understanding of the issues involved. The recommendation had been approved years ago, but was still held up in committee. A tragedy. A small voice inside his head reminded him that the training idea had been a foundryman's proposal, and that the subcommittee obstructing it was dominated by the tailors and the joiners. He stowed the fact carefully away in his mental quiver for future use. 3 approved amendments. He thought some more about that. 3 amendments by a serving officer. Usually, an amendment was held to be the glorious culmination of a long and distinguished career. It was something you held back until it was time for you to retire, and there'd be a little ceremony. The Chief Inspector of Ordnance would shake you by the hand in front of the assembled workforce, and present you with your letter of patent at the same time as your long service certificate. It wasn't a perfect system, because a man might have to wait 15 years before submitting his amendment, all that time churning out a product he knew could be improved. But it was worthwhile because it limited exposure to the innovation bug. Only a very few men proposed amendments while they were still working, and nearly all such applications were rejected on principle regardless of merit. 3, for God's sake. Why hadn't he heard about this man years ago? And why, when the facts were here in the file for anyone to see, hadn't he been put under level 6 supervision after the first proposal? In a sense, Celis thought we failed him. He was reminded of the old story about the man who kept a baby manticore for the eggs, until, at last one day, the manticore, fully grown and reverting to its basic nature, killed him. We let Va'atzis walk this highly dangerous path alone, because the amendments were all good, sound engineering, allowing us to improve the performance of the product. Credit for that improvement would have gone primarily to the Chief Inspector of Ordnance, and from him to the members of the Department Steering Committee. Manticore eggs. One last page caught his eye. Schedule of items seized by investigators from the prisoner's house after his arrest. It was a short list. Usually when a man came to no good, there'd be pages of this sort of thing. Tools and equipment stolen from the factory, the usual depressing catalog of pornographic or subversive literature, always the same titles. The circulating repertoire of both categories were reassuringly small in Mesentia. Forbidden articles of clothing, prescribed food and drink, religious fetishes. In this case, however, there were only a handful of items, and none of them were strictly illegal, though they were all disapproved. A portfolio of drawings of yet more amendments to the Scorpion, a note in the margin pointing out that the drawings numbered 7, 26, and 41 should be forwarded to the Standing Committee for assessment since they appeared to have considerable merit. A book, The True Mirror of Defense, a fencing manual, copied in Civitas Vedanis. Private ownership of weapons was, of course, strictly forbidden. Whether it was also illegal to read books about them was something of a gray area. Another book, The Art of Venery, about hunting and falconry. Celis smiled. He was prepared to bet that Vasis had thought the word venery meant something quite different. Another book, A General Discourse of Bodily Ailments and the Complete Herbal, together with some pots of dried leaves and a pestle and mortar. Celis frowned. He'd have to check, but he had an idea that the General Discourse was still a permitted text in the physicians. So it was against the law for a foundryman to have a copy. So how had he come by it? Did that mean that somewhere there was a doctor with a complete set of engineer's thread and drilling tables? If so, why? He'd closed the file, feeling vaguely uncomfortable, as though he'd been handling something dirty. A case like this was, of course, an effective remedy for incipient complacency. It was easy to forget how perilously fine was the line between normality and aberration. How simple and straightforward life would be if all the deviants were wild-eyed, unkempt, and slobbering, and all the honest men upright and clean-shaven. There wasn't really anything disturbing about a thoroughgoing deviant. It was inevitable that from time to time nature would throw up an occasional monster, easy to identify and quickly disposed of. Far more disquieting, the man who's almost normal but not quite. He looks and sounds rational. You can work beside him for years and never hear anything to give you cause for concern, until one day he's not at his post, and investigators are interviewing the whole department. Truly disquieting, because there's always the possibility, orthodox doctrine denies it categorically, but you can't help wondering that anybody, everybody, might be capable of just one small aberration if circumstances conspired to put an opportunity in their path. If the temptation was strong enough, perhaps even me. Celis shuddered at the thought, and dismissed it from his mind as moral hypochondria. Look at his list of symptoms long enough, you can convince yourself you've got everything. It was just as well, he decided, that he wasn't an investigator working in the field. You need to have nerves of steel, or no imagination whatsoever, to survive in that job. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and waited to see if an image of Vaatius would form in his mind. He thought of the process as something like what happens to an egg when it's broken in the frying pan, but all he got was a vague shape, a cutout and a black backcloth, through which you could catch glimpses of what lay behind. His best hope of understanding the man, he decided, lay in interviewing the wife. If there was a key to the mystery, either she'd be it or have an idea of where it was to be found. Strictly speaking, of course, none of this was necessary. They weren't being asked to understand the man, just hunt him down and kill him. Probably just as well. Even so, the pathology of aberration was worth studying, in spite of the obvious danger to the student. Or else how could further outbreaks be prevented in the future? Definitely the wife, Celis decided. She was the anomaly he kept coming back to. He stood up, shook himself like a wet dog to get rid of unwelcome burrs of thought. A man could lose himself in work like this, and in his case that would be a sad waste. There were other letters waiting for him. He'd seen them when he came in, but forgotten about them while his mind was full of Vaatsis and that dreadful man Chrysostom. As was his custom, he broke the seals of all of them before he started to read. 2 circular memoranda about dead issues, minutes of meetings of committees he wasn't a member of, for information only, a letter from his cousin attached to the diplomatic mission to the Curidoce, asking him to look up something in the Absolute Concordance, some nonsense about the structure of leaves and the diseases of oak trees, notice of a lecture on early Mannerist poetry, an invitation to speak from a learned society he no longer belonged to. The sad thing was, if he didn't get letters like these, he'd feel left out, worried that he might be slipping gradually out of favor. He made a note to tell his clerk to check the oak disease reference. He'd take the speaking engagement, standard acknowledgments to all the rest. So much for the day's mail, the world bringing him new challenges to revel in, like a cat that will insist on presenting you with its freshly slain mice. Another glass of brandy was a virtual necessity if he didn't want to lie awake all night thinking about Vaatsis and deviants in general. One last note to his clerk: set up meetings with Vaatsis' wife, father, and brother-in-law. Yes, that was where the answers lay. He was almost certain of that. It would help him make sense of it all if she turned out to be pretty, but he wasn't inclined to hold his breath. In the event, he slept soundly, dreaming of Manuel Chrysostom being eaten alive by monkeys, so that he woke early with a smile on his face, ready for breakfast. His clerk had already come and gone, so he took his time shaving and dressing. It was always pleasant not to have to rush in the mornings. He even had time to trim his nails and pumice yesterday's ink stains from his fingertips. That made him smile. Subconsciously, was he preening himself, just in case the deviant's wife did turn out to be pretty? And he back-combed his hair in gentle self-mockery. Then he thought about his wife spending the off-season at the lodge, out in the Blatchen with the rest of the committee wives. And that took the feather off his clean, sharp mood. Still, he wouldn't have to join her for a month at least, which was something. The first 3 hours of every working day were eaten up by letters, from the Morals and Ethics Directorate, the Assessment Board, the Treasurer's Office, the Performance Standards Commission. 20 years in the service, and he still didn't know what they actually did. The General Auditors of Requisitions, the Foreign Affairs Committee. 3 of them he answered himself. 2 he left for his clerk to deal with. One went to one side for filing in the box he privately thought of as the coal seam. The process left him feeling drained and irritable, as though he'd been cooped up in a small room, with a lot of people all talking at once. To restore his equilibrium, he spent half an hour tinkering with the 3rd draft of his address to the Apprentices' Conference, at which he would be the keynote speaker for the 4th year running. Doctrine, a Living Legacy. He was contemplating the best way to give a didactic spin to the proceedings of the 3rd Recensionist Council, when his clerk arrived to tell him that the abominator's wife would be arriving at noon. He'd forgotten all about her, and his first reaction was irritation. He had a desk full of more important things to do than talk to criminals' wives, but as the day wore on, he found himself looking forward to the break in his routine. His clerk, he suspected, was getting to know him a little too well. The hour between noon and resumption was his least productive time, the part of the day when he was most likely to make mistakes. Far better to use it for something restful and quiet, where a momentary lapse in concentration wasn't likely to involve the state in embarrassment and ruin. There were 5 interrogation rooms on the 7th floor of the Guildhall. He chose the smallest and left instructions that he wasn't to be disturbed. The woman was punctual. She turned up half an hour early. Celis left her to wait, on the bench in the front corridor. A little apprehension, forced on like chicory by solitude and confinement, would do no harm at all, and he'd have time to read another couple of letters. He'd been right. She was pretty enough, in a small, wide-eyed sort of way. He had the dossier's conclusive evidence that she was 24. Without it, he'd have put her somewhere between 19 and 21. So what she must have looked like when she was 17 and the subject of negotiations between her father and the abominator, he wouldn't have liked to say. She sat on the low, backless chair in the corner of the room, quite still, reminding him of something he couldn't place for a long time, until it suddenly dawned on him. He'd seen a mewed falcon once, jest and hooded, standing motionless on a perch shaped like a bent bow. An incongruous comparison, he told himself. She certainly didn't come across as a predator, quite the opposite. You couldn't imagine such a delicate creature eating anything, let alone prey that had once been alive. He sat down in the big, high-backed chair and rested his hands on the armrests, wrists upward. He'd seen judges do that, and it had stuck in his mind. "Your name?" he said. Her voice was surprisingly deep. "Ariesa Vaatis Kanena," she said. There was no bashful hesitation, but her eyes were big and round and deep. So are a hawk's, he thought. "Why am I here?" "There are some questions," he said, and left it at that. "You were married young, I gather." She frowned. "Not really," she said. "At least I was 17, but 5 of the 15 girls in my class got married before I did." She was right, of course. He'd misplaced the emphasis. It wasn't her youth that was unusual, but her husband's age. "You married a man 10 years older than yourself," he said. She nodded. "That's right." "Why?" What a curious question, her eyes said. "My father thought it was a good match," she said. "Was it?" "Well, clearly not." "You were unhappy with the idea?" "Not at the time," she said firmly. "Of course," Celis said gravely. "You weren't to know how things would turn out." "No." "At the time," he said, "did you find the marriage agreeable?" A faint trace of a smile. There are some faces that light up in smiling, and this wasn't one. "That's a curious word to use," she said. "I loved my husband from the first time I saw him." "Do you still love him?" "Yes." She said the word crisply, like someone breaking a stick. He thought for a moment. Another comparison was lurking in the back of his mind, but he couldn't place it. "You're aware of the law regarding the wives of abominators?" She nodded and said nothing. She didn't seem unduly frightened. "There is, of course, a discretion in such cases," he said slowly. I see. She was watching him, the way one animal watches another, wary, cautious, but no fear beyond the permanent, all-encompassing fear of creatures who live all the time surrounded by predators and prey. The discretion, he went on, vests in the proper compliance officer of the Offenders Guild. Well, that would be you, then. That's right. I imagine, she said, there's something I can help you with? In her dossier, which he'd glanced through before the interview, there was a certificate from the investigators. The wife, they said, had not been party to the offense, and was not to be proceeded against. Her father and brother were guildsmen of good standing, and had cooperated unreservedly in the investigation, on the understanding that she should be spared. It was, of course, a condition of this arrangement that she should not know of it, nor had she been made aware of the fact that clemency had been extended in her case. Yes, Celis said. There are a few questions, as I think I mentioned. You want me to betray him, don't you? Celis moved a little in his chair. The back and arms seemed to be restricting him, like guards holding a prisoner. I shall expect you to cooperate with my inquiries, he said. You know who I am, what I do. She nodded. There's nothing I can tell you, she said. I don't know where he's gone or anything like that. I do, Celis said. Her eyes opened wide. No other movement, and no sound. We have reports, he went on, that place him in the company of Duke Orsi of Arumia Montis. Do you know who he is? Of course I do, she said. How did he... Celis ignored her. Clearly, he said, this raises new questions. For example, do you think it possible that your husband had been in contact with the Arumians at any time before his arrest? You mean spying for them or something? She raised an eyebrow. Well, if he was, he can't have done a very good job. He'd seen a fencing match once, an exhibition bout between two foreigners, Vadani or Curidoce or something of the sort. He remembered the look on the face of one of them, when he lunged forward ferociously to run his enemy through, but when he reached forward full stretch, the other man wasn't there anymore. He'd sidestepped, and as his opponent surged past him, he'd give him a neat little prod in the ribs, and down he'd gone. Celis had an uncomfortable feeling that the expression on his face wasn't so different to the look he'd seen on the dying fencers. You didn't answer my question, he said. No, she said, I don't think he was spying for Arumia. I don't think he'd have known where Arumia is. I didn't, she added, not until the other day. A lot of people don't. You sound very certain, he said quietly. Yes, she said. A pause, then. I know what my husband did was wrong. One of your colleagues explained it all to me, and I understand. But that was all he did, I'm absolutely positive. He just did it for our little girl, for her birthday. I suppose he thought nobody'd ever find out. Celis looked at her for a while. She ought to be frightened, he thought. At the very least, she ought to be frightened. Maybe her father or her brother broke the terms of the deal and told her. But then she'd know that if we found out, the deal would be off, and she ought to be frightened about that. I don't think she likes me very much. He thought about that. I don't like her very much either, he thought. So, he went on. You don't think your husband took any interest in politics, foreign affairs, things like that? Good Lord, no. He couldn't care less. He nodded. What did he care about? Us, she said, quick as a parry. Me and our daughter, our family. Celis nodded. His work? Yes, she said. It was a concession. But he didn't talk about it much at home. He tried to keep it separate, home and work. I could never understand about machinery and things. But he did work at home sometimes. She shrugged. In the evenings, she said. Sometimes he'd be in the back room in the cellar making things. He liked doing it, but I don't know if it was work or things he made for himself or us. Celis nodded again. It's customary for an engineer to make some of his own tools, specialized tools, not the sorts of thing you'd find hanging on the rack in his own time. Do you think it's likely that that was what he was doing? She shrugged. No words. We found quite a few such tools, he went on, in the house and at his bench in the factory. The quality of the work was very high. She looked at him. He was a clever man, she said. Too clever, Celis said. But it wasn't like the fencer's ambush. Leaden-footed and a blind man could have seen it coming. Nevertheless, she must parry it or else be hit. He waited to see what form her defense would take. He anticipated a good defense from a fencer of such skill in metal, not a mere block. He was hoping for a maneuver combining defense and counterattack in the same move, what Vaazzi's illegal fencing manual would call a riposte in narrow time. He made a mental note to requisition the book and read it when he had a moment. Yes, she said. Oh, Celis thought. Well, it was a riposte of a sort. Stand still and let your opponent skewer you and die, leaving the enemy to feel wretched and guilty ever after. Probably the most damaging riposte of it all, if all you cared about was hurting the opponent. I had a point once, he told himself. I was making it, but I can't remember what it was. So that's the picture, is it? He said. In the evenings, after dinner, while you wash the dishes, he retreats to his private bench with his files and hacksaws and bow drills and makes things for the pure pleasure of it. Is that how it was? She frowned. Well, sometimes, she said. Sometimes, Celis repeated. You'd have thought he'd had enough of it at work, measuring and marking out and cutting metal and finishing and burnishing and polishing and so on. He liked that sort of thing, she said, and her voice was almost bored. It was what he did when we were first married, but then he got promoted, supervisor and then foreman. He was telling other people what to do instead of doing it himself. She shrugged. He was glad of the promotion, obviously, but I think he missed actually making things with his hands. Or maybe he wanted to keep himself in practice. I don't know about that kind of stuff, but maybe if you stop doing it for a while you forget how to do it. You'd know more about it than me. Celis nodded. You think he wanted to keep his hand in? She shrugged again. Her slim shoulders were perfectly suited to the gesture, which was probably why she favored it so much. Do you think he'll want to keep his hand in now, while he's with Duke Orsi? To his surprise, she nodded, as though she was a colleague rather than a subject brought in for interrogation. I know, she said. They explained it to me before. You're afraid he'll teach all sorts of trade secrets to the enemy. Do you think he's liable to do that? I don't know, she said. You don't know, he repeated. That's right, she said. I suppose it'll depend on what he's got to do to stay alive. I mean, the people you say he's with, they're our enemies. We just wiped out their army, isn't that right? Well, maybe they caught him wandering about on the moors and thought he was a spy or something. Celis frowned. Possibly. Well then, if you were him, and that's what happened to you, what would you do? Celis leaned back a bit in his chair. He felt a need to increase the distance between them. I hope, he said, that I would die rather than betray my country. It sounded completely ridiculous, of course, and she didn't bother to react. She didn't need to. She didn't need to point out what Va'atzi's country had done to him in the first place. This wasn't getting anywhere, Celis decided. He was there to get information, not defend himself. Fine, she said. I'm glad to hear it. She was letting him off lightly, though. She was past his guard, controlling the bind, in a strong position to shrug off his defense and strike home. Which is what you'd do, surely, if your husband had just been driven into exile. You'd be angry. But she was no more angry than frightened. Curious hawk. Doesn't strike her bait? It dawned on him suddenly why he felt so confused. It was as though he didn't matter. I take it, he persevered, though he knew he was achieving nothing by it, that you feel the same about treachery. She looked at him. You mean about betraying the Republic? Well, of course. He frowned at her, trying to be intimidating, and failing. I'm not concentrating, he realized. There's something wrong, like one of those tiny splinters that gets in right under your skin, too small to see but you can feel them. The circumstances, he said slowly, of your marriage. Let's go back to that, shall we? If you want. He made a show of making himself comfortable in his chair. When was the first time he became aware of you? How did you meet? She was looking at him as though he was standing in front of something she wanted to see, blocking her view. Which do you want me to answer first? She said. Why did he want to marry you? Another beautiful shrug. I think he wanted to get married, she said. Men do. And my dad wanted to find me a husband. At 17. A bit quick off the mark. We never got on, she said. I wasn't happy at home. He wanted you off his hands. Yes. Celis winced. She's good, he noted ruefully at that defense. Probably one hell of a card player, if women play cards. Do they? He had to admit he didn't know. So your father became aware that his supervisor was looking for a wife and thought, here's a fine opportunity, 2 birds with 1 stone. Is that how it was? Pretty much. He hesitated. It was like when he'd been a boy, fighting in the playground. He'd been a good fighter. He had the reach and good reflexes, and he was older than most of the other boys. He threw a good punch to the nose, chin, or mouth, but he was too scared to fight because he hated the pain, jarring his elbow as he bashed into their faces, skinning his knuckles as he broke their teeth, until the pleasure of inflicting pain ceased to outweigh the discomfort of receiving it. Even hitting them with sticks hurt his hands more than he was prepared to accept. Was it a deal, then? He persevered. Your father and your brother's promotions in exchange for you? Yes. I see. And how about the terms of the transaction? Was he buying sight unseen? What does that mean? Did he come and inspect you first before the deal was finalized? Or wasn't he bothered? She frowned as though she was having trouble understanding. He came to dinner at our house, she said. And? He sat next to me. We talked about birds. Birds. She nodded. I don't know how we got on the subject. I wasn't particularly interested in birds, nor was he. But you'd already fallen in love at first sight? Yes. More gashed knuckles. And presumably he decided you would fit the bill. Yes. So everybody was happy. Yes, we were all happy. The hell with this, Celis thought. There was a time long ago when I used to be a decent human being. I see, he said. Well, I don't think I need to detain you further. You may go. She stood up. No hurry, no delay. Your discretion, she said. She made it sound like an illness or something. Provided you undertake to let us know immediately if you hear anything from him, if he tries to get in touch with you in any way. Do you understand? She nodded. Hardly likely, though, is it? Nonetheless. He made his face stern and fierce. Make no mistake, he said. You're being discharged under license, which we can revoke at any time. The obligation is on you to come to us with any information which might be of use to us. If you fail to do so, I understand. Very well, then. You may leave. He thought of something, too little too late, but it would be a small victory. He'd at least have drawn blood, even if it was just a scratch. You may return to the matrimonial home for the time being, he said, long enough to collect your possessions, the things that belong to you exclusively, clothing and the like. After that, you'll be returned to your father's house. She rode the strike well, but he'd touched home. There was a degree of satisfaction in the hit, but rather less than he'd anticipated. I see, she said. An offender's property, he went on, reverts to his guild. An official confiscator will be appointed shortly until he's made his inspection and compiled an inventory. You may not remove anything from the house. Fine. Can I empty the chamber pot? Interesting. That's the first sign of anger that she'd shown. The confiscator, he went on, will issue a certificate specifying which items are your exclusive property. That means the things you'll be allowed to take away with you. If you disagree with his decision, you may make representations to him in writing. Is that clear? She nodded. How about my daughter's things? She said. Can she keep them, or does the guild want them too? The same rules apply, Celis said. The confiscator will decide what she can keep. The adjudication process usually takes about 6 weeks. I see, he said. Can I leave now, please? Celis raised his hand in a vague gesture of manumission. Thank you for your time, he said, and remember if you hear anything at all from your husband. After she had gone, Celis sat for a while, watching the lamp burn down. Had he achieved what he'd set out to do, or anything at all? He'd had no idea. The objective was to catch Ziani Vaatzis and bring him home to die, or kill him wherever he happened to be. That job had been given to Manuel Chrysostom and was therefore effectively out of Celis' hands for the time being. The purpose of this interview, he tried to remember what it was, something about motivation, trying to understand. He'd been intrigued by the marriage and the difference in ages. Well, he had an explanation of sorts. Vaatzis had wanted a wife, the man Kanenis had wanted to get his stroppy daughter off his hands, and apparently the daughter had been obliging enough to fall in love with Vaatzis, who was in a position to square the deal with promotions for his new in-laws. There, everything accounted for, neat and tidy. And he, Lukaus Celis, was sitting in the dark, as the point flew high over his head like a skein of geese going home for the winter. No, he'd learned something important today, and he had no idea what it was. When the lamp finally failed, he stood up and tracked his way to the door by feel. Outside it was still broad daylight. As he stood in the corridor, facing the open window, the light stunned him like an unexpected punch. It'd be vexing, he told himself, if Chrysostom succeeded. As for Vaatzis, Celis found it very hard to recapture the cold, pure burn of anger against him, for his however many it was offenses against specification. But he stood facing the light and made a wish, like he used to do in the first of the month when he was a boy, that Chrysostom would bring Vaatzis' head home in a bag soon, and that this case would very quickly be over.